Do you remember when you read your favourite book as a kid, and then you find out that it was made into a movie or show? You give it a watch, and it's not quite how you envisioned it. Although adapting an innocent children's book to the silver screen is not always a straightforward task. Occasionally, some adaptations seem to take a unique spin on the material, either being down to a lack of resources, or the execution not being as refined. This sometimes leads to a final product being unintentionally disturbing. So today, let's take a look at some of these disturbing book-to-screen adaptations. Before we start, I just want to set a ground rule that I'm discounting adaptations where they deliberately warp the original source material into a deliberate horror. I think that's a bit of a cheat right there. I'm looking for renditions of stories where they were always intended for a family audience. Also, to make this a bit more challenging for myself, I'm going to discount properties where they were always a little bit mature to begin with. So no Watership down, I'm afraid. The sort of stories I'm looking for were always quite innocent to begin with. And one more thing, I just want to clarify that this isn't me criticising these properties for being slightly uncanny, as I do generally love some of these entries, regardless if they're uncanny, creepy or dark. Alright, with the context out of the way, let's begin the list. Five Children in It was initially a British children's book published back in 1902, being about a group of 5 kids encountering an ancient creature called the Psammead, also known as a sand fairy, who has the capability of performing wishes. However, there's a catch: the wishes only last up until sunset. After that, the effects of the wishes wear off. Throughout the decades, the book has always been immensely popular in Britain. As a result, there have been several adaptations. The BBC made a 2-part special in 1951. Details of that version have been sadly lost to time. The BBC then made a mini-series based off the first book in the early 90s, which was successful enough to warrant 2 sequel series. And there was the 2020 Sky movie For Children in It, being based off the Jacqueline Wilson book with the same name, acting as a semi-sequel to the original story. But the one we'll be talking about for this video is the 2004 movie adaptation. The movie itself isn't a dark adaptation. It's a light-hearted, fun family film. Although what separates this adaptation from the rest is the design for the Psammead, as unlike the prior movies and shows, where they made him look like a furry version of Master Yoda, in the 2004 film he looks like E.T.'s granddad. Although it's the only adaptation made so far that comes close of at least matching the silhouette of the original Psammead illustrations. Which is rather ironic for me to say that, as in the behind the scenes featurette, the designers purposely strayed away from the book's illustrations. They attempted to give the Psammead a sort of prehistoric look, which is appropriate as the Psammead does mention that he saw pterodactyls back in his day. The sand fairy was brought to life via a combination of CGI and practical effects, supplied by the Jim Henson Company. The Psammead was voiced by Eddie Izzard. He makes the character very wisecracking and spouting a lot of pop culture jokes.
Sand fairy?
You're still here. I'm not in the French one. But if you look online, you see that the trailer for it, at the end, they've got the guy going, "Para para 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 poo." That guy who did the dubbing of that, he has no idea what he's doing. He thinks it's just something that they did back in Victorian / Edwardian times.
Yep, it was definitely a very 2000s movie.
Yes, I did ad-lib. Horace never with the sand fairy. And that was cut out, kids.
One of my early cinema experiences I can remember going to was watching the Mike Myers film The Cat in the Hat.
A monster?
Where?
I was quite uncomfortable with the cat's first scene, so we left the screening. It was certainly a memorable experience. Mixed in with the uncanny makeup, we have quite a fair few adult jokes that wouldn't be out of place in either a Shrek or Austin Powers movie, but they're certainly quite jarring in a Dr. Seuss title.
Dirty hoe?
Yeah, keeping it classy, why don't ya? This movie may be a mess, but at least compared to the other adaptations we have on this list, it's far from being too unsettling. It's just oddly very inappropriate for its source material. That, and it's easily the most colourful film out of the rest. And if there's one silver lining, Audrey Geisel made sure that there were no more live-action adaptations during her lifetime. I'm sure it could easily be done, but just not with the same vision like The Cat or The Grinch. I'm not ranking these entries by personal favourites, but if I did, this would easily have to be number 1. And I certainly don't feel alone with the opinion. Every time on the online space when Return to Oz is brought up, it's always described as a hidden gem that deserves some more love, and rightly so. It's been the one Disney movie I've been waiting for the longest for some kind of special edition release. Either as a Blu-ray or 4K release jam-packed with extra features, or a really comprehensible documentary on Disney+. Return to Oz acts as a soft sequel to the original Wizard of Oz story, adapting Oz books 2 and 3, playing very fast and loose with the source material, and giving the Oz stories a coat of dark paint. Although for me as a kid, the darkest scene was this bit of dialogue exchanged between Dorothy and the Gump.
The last thing I remember is walking through the forest and hearing a loud noise. And now, here I am, flying through the air.
I think it was just the mental image of that prequel scene playing out in my head.
I must say, this life is stranger than my last one.
Released in the UK in 1948 was David Lean's adaptation of the Dickens story, Oliver Twist. While the original 1838 novel wasn't strictly a children's story, it could be admired and enjoyed by a diverse age group. After all, it was turned into a successful musical production in 1968. However, unlike the musical adaptation, the 1948 Oliver Twist is far less savoury. The movie starts with Oliver's mum being heavily pregnant, struggling to get to the workhouse. And shortly after giving birth, she passes away. A maiden carries the baby Oliver through the workhouse, painting not such an optimistic outlook for the child. Oliver is put through quite the ordeal. The movie certainly doesn't make it an easy journey for himself. While the original story certainly wasn't a happy tale, this movie ramps it up to about 11.
He don't deserve it.
Poor little fellow, he's hurt himself.
I did that, sir. I stopped him.
Poor Oliver doesn't capture a break throughout. Everybody takes advantage of Oliver's vulnerability, even those who are trying to help him.
What's your name? He says his name's Tom White, your worship.
Although this movie was particularly controversial over the depiction of Fagin. Ever since the original book was published, Fagin was frequently criticised for looking like an anti-Semitic depiction of a Jewish stereotype. As for the 1948 film version, Fagin, played by Alice Guinness, was given a lot of heavy prosthetics to look more precisely like the original Fagin from the story. The director pointed out that in the book, Fagin was never mentioned as being Jewish. However, that didn't stop a lot of heavy critique over Fagin's depiction. It was so bad that the movie got delayed being released in the US, and when it finally got released back in 1951, at least 12 minutes were removed out to make Fagin seem more favourable. The Animal Tales from Beatrix Potter have been some of the most beloved British children's stories written in the last century. There's been a fair few adaptations over the years of the stories. From my generation, I grew up with the BBC miniseries, adapting 9 of the Potter books. Whenever it comes to modern critiques of children's entertainment, I always find the phrase "they don't make them like they used to" a little bit too overused. It's a far too easy crutch to lean back on. But at least looking in the category of recent Potter projects, I really can't help but feel that they don't make them like they used to. These adaptations go to great lengths to majorly contemporize the stories. On the other hand, the BBC series The World of Peter Rabbit and Friends so faithfully emulate the original stories that they feel like that they're a product from another era, in a good kind of way. Because the Potter stories were being written during the early 20th century, the programme is certainly very unnerving. Some of the ones that have stuck with me over the years is The Tale of Peter Rabbit, a story warning children to not adventure into places they shouldn't, as despite Peter being more courteous, adventuring into Miss McGregor's garden for the second time, in this mission he ends up in a worse state than before. And the episode with Hermione Puddle Duck. Her and her eggs are very nearly eaten by the fox. Thankfully, by the story's end, a group of dogs come in to save her, but not so much for her eggs.
Oh dear.
Another rather unsettling story is the tale of Pigling Bland, a little piglet where he's lost on his way to the market and is taken into refuge by a senior man who seems to have a devious motivation. Pigling Bland is not physically trapped at the premises, but his innocent naivety is certainly taken advantage of.
Oh, and don't meddle with naught mind, or I'll come back and skin you.
To an extent, it is a very uncomfortable story.
You feel nice and fat to me.
Although the Potter stories still have that quaint, dry British humour.
Why don't you run away?
I shall. Off to supper.
Made 45 years before the Disney version, French director Cocteau's own rendition of Beauty and the Beast was easily the most well-known film rendition of the fairy tale. The project was being produced right at the tail end of World War II. Because of the ongoing rations, the fabric material had to be made out of scraps for the costumes. The movie was a technical marvel of its time. Candles that are able to be ignited on their own. This was achieved by blowing out the candles as normal and then reversing the footage. Actor of the Beast, Jean Murray, had to endure 3 hours to be fitted into the makeup, and his teeth were slotted in, making it impractical for him to eat anything. A necklace where if it's held by somebody who's unworthy, it turns into a root. Slow down the footage and you'll see how they were able to achieve this effect. The story itself is rather simple, just like the fairy tale. However, the movie itself isn't very colourful. In fact, it's quite dark. There's many unsettling atmospheric moments. The furniture is alive and watching you. In fact, if you weren't familiar with the original tale, in this film it would be very easy to mistake the Beast as being the villain. Before we even get to see the Beast, we see its prey that it's hunted. It's quite the build-up, isn't it? From director Steve Barron, who had previously worked on Jim Henson's The Storyteller, brought us his own reimagined interpretation of Pinocchio in 1996. Utilising the aid from the Jim Henson Company in order to achieve a lot of the practical effects. And for a lot of people growing up, the effects were certainly memorable in a very twisted way. I'll certainly will admit, this movie did briefly put me off going on theme park rides as a kid. However, every Pinocchio film with a donkey transformation always ends up being quite unholy. Although, if there's one silver lining that this Pinocchio adaptation has over the rest, it's that it's one of the very few renditions where the donkeys get reverted back into boys. So, you know, that's a little bit of something. But it certainly doesn't take away from the nightmares. During the 1960s, a company known as Westworld Artists were attempting to create an animated series based off the Oz books. Titled The Wonderland of Oz, it had a very interesting art style.
Abracadabra porterhouse steak, mince pie, ice cream, chocolate cake, chicken legs, candy, and little green peas. Appear on my table with magic, please.
This was utilizing a brand new filmmaking technique called animoscope. According to the company's demo video, this effect was achieved via filming a live-action actor and then retracing the movements on final color cells. According to some interviews of the people who developed the technology, it also featured more complicated steps, such as applying heavy makeup to the live-action actors in order to add in the line work, and a couple of chemical techniques applied to the film in order to really stylize the footage. The promo video boasts on how much more cheaper it is compared to normal animation and live-action projects. Although I think this is just adding a lot more complicated steps. Animoscope isn't too dissimilar to another technique, rotoscope, quite famously used by filmmaker Ralph Bakshi for his animated movies. Rotoscope can sometimes be a little bit uncanny, but at least with the Bakshi titles such as Fire and Ice and Lord of the Rings, the more lifelike animation complements the more dramatic and grittier stories. Trying to apply it to a show that's meant to be much more cartoonier and bouncier, The Wonderland of Oz is a tiny bit uncanny.
Not me. It's dark in there. I'd be scared.
Oh yeah, you certainly look scared, don't you, mate? Unfortunately, beyond this promo video, there isn't much else known about the Wonderland of Oz. And beyond the mid-60s, I couldn't find any other updates about Westworld. As they always say, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Whenever it comes to shortcut techniques such as animoscope, rotoscope, motion capture, and even AI, in the end, artists and filmmakers always revert back to doing it manually, and products such as these only really blossom in the short term. Before we move on, here's another unfinished project from the same team. Only given the title Colormation Screen Test, it's a sci-fi piece featuring an astronaut named Scotty, who's out on a rescue mission. Now, just get a load of the dialogue.
A woman? What in blazes is she doing in a spaceship?
I am Major Vaslov of the Eastern Space Patrol, Captain.
A woman pilot?
Nearly half our pilots are women, Captain.
No wonder your ship's falling apart. I never did know a woman who could handle a spaceship.
Cut it, Scott, and get that lifeboat out. You're wasting time.
It's the most 1960s writing I've ever heard. What the hell? The Chronicles of Narnia has been one of the most acclaimed children's book series written in the last 70 years. As a result, there's been quite a fair few adaptations. However, the most elusive out of all of these was a black and white 10-part series that aired on British television throughout the year of 1967, being based on the first published book in the series, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, possibly being the very first book-to-screen adaptation of one of the Narnia stories. Since at the time British television were filmed as if they were live theatre shows, the production values of this programme very much reflect this. The Narnia animals were brought to life via costume characters, although for the characters like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and Aslan, facial makeup was given to the actors, in a similar fashion to the lion in the 1939 Wizard of Oz movie. although Aslam's makeup makes him look far less approachable in comparison. In the majority of Narnia adaptations, Aslam is depicted as a noble but soft-spoken leader, especially being very sensitive around the children. Although in the 1963 TV series, he certainly does have a pressure point.
There must be something you can do about this deep magic. Isn't there something you could work against it?
Work against the Emperor's magic! Never make that suggestion again, any of you!
This Aslam does seem a little less patient, but it would be misleading to say that he didn't have any tender moments.
Let us come with you wherever you're going, please.
Well, I shall be glad of some company tonight. You may come with me, but only if you promise to stop when I tell you to, and leave me to go on alone.
Thank you, thank you. We will. We promise.
Unfortunately, out of the 10 episodes that were produced, only 2 are currently known to exist. Episode 1, What Lucy Finds in the Wardrobe, and Episode 8, The Triumph of the Witch, which ends on an eerie cliffhanger. The 1933 Paramount film Alice in Wonderland was far from the first screen adaptation of the Alice books, as prior to this there had already been several silent movies and a talkie created back in 1931. However, what separates this Alice adaptation from the rest is its rather interesting visuals. 1933 was certainly a big year for special effects in movies. There were the stop-motion creatures in King Kong, and the optical effects in The Invisible Man. That year's Alice in Wonderland movie had an ambitious task, trying to recreate the more out-there looking characters, via extensively using prosthetic makeup in order to achieve this.
How would you like it if I were to cut a slice out of you?
By this point in Hollywood's history, prosthetic makeup was nothing new. The craftsmanship was utilised before in many previous films, and quite successfully. Take for example the ape makeup in 1927's The Monkey Talks. It certainly gives the later Planet of the Apes movies a run for their money. However, unlike those previous productions, this was now going to be spread thin on the whole core cast, and they had to retain a very certain style, trying to stay faithful to the original book illustrations. The result was off-putting to say the least. Now, there's nothing wrong with a book adaptation for a movie or show to attempt to stay faithful, but perhaps during a time where prosthetic makeup hadn't quite proven itself yet, it may have been best to somewhat deviate from the illustrations.
Better.
Take the Wizard of Oz movie made some years later. The makeup to the Scarecrow and Tin Man are fairly lined up with the original illustrations of the book. However, the interpretation for the lion in the movie is drastically different, as in the book the lion was meant to be a literal lion. The filmmakers considered to make the lion either an animated character or a trained real lion, but it wouldn't have gelled with the comedic timing with the other actors. So they made the character an anthropomorphic lion instead, deviating from the source material but doing something different and making it work. Now compare that with the 33 Alice in Wonderland.
Wow.
Literally bringing the characters off the pages and trying to make it work within the confinements of 1930s technology, this was always going to be a very special movie. To be fair, some of the costumes aren't too bad and are in fact rather tasteful by today's standards. But it's those characters where you can see a mouth within a mouth is the sort of stuff that nightmares are made out of.
If you think we're waxworks, you ought to pay, you know.
And then other characters like the Griffin and the Mock Turtle, you either suspend your disbelief with the costumes, or you laugh at it for what it is. The cast are so unrecognisable that at the beginning of the movie, it starts with a picture book showing the actors in and out of makeup. But easily the most infamous character that appeared in the movie, or the most meme-worthy if we're going by contemporary slang, is Humpty Dumpty, played by W.C. Fields. In real life, Fields was always labelled as to having a head in the same shape as an egg, so I suppose you can call this an ironic role.
What a beautiful bell.
For many in this movie, Humpty Dumpty looks off-putting, but for me, I can't help but amusingly think about that just behind that wall, that Fields is concealing the rest of his body. Look, you can just see it in this shot. Yeah, I've watched this movie way too many times. For a very long time, this movie was extremely scarce to watch. In almost 80 years, the only way to see the movie was if you were lucky enough to catch it on television. It wasn't until in 2010 the film received its one and only home media release on DVD and Blu-ray. So, would I recommend this movie? Nah. The movie has always been fairly divided. It flopped and it was critically muted. Placing the off-putting visuals aside and judging it as a whole, the script is undeniably problematic. The Lewis Carroll books are always really difficult to adapt as they're rather episodic with no plot, and the nonsensical storyline really doesn't do the movie any favours. Although I will say, if you do love out-of-context clips, then this film is delightfully perfect for that. Even with context, it's a very odd film. Unless if you're into film history or love the Alice stories, I couldn't strongly recommend it.